Police let Bobiwine watch some of the footage, but not the part where his brother was taken. There was a clue in the video though, a white Toyota Hiace, with a number plate. The tax authorities said the registration was held by a car sales company. Staff at the company told Bobiwine that they had sold the car in question to the police, except that the vehicle they sold was not a Hiace, suggesting the number plate had been switched. "My brother must be saying who is coming for my rescue," said Bobiwine in January. "Now I can't sit unless I know that the person is dead or is alive." On December 31, a High Court judge ordered the police and army to release Muwonge. Nothing happened. 5 weeks later, the Minister of Internal Affairs said investigations are still ongoing to establish his whereabouts. It was only when Muwonge spoke, 2 months after Muwonge disappeared, that there was concrete news. Muwonge had been arrested by commandos, the president said. On February 17 he was finally released, charged by police with inciting violence. On their quest to find Denis Matavu, his family would sometimes meet strangers who would scribble down a number on a sheet of paper. "Call this number," they would say. "This person can help you find him." When the family called, the voice on the other end asked for money to cover their costs, 1,000,000 shillings, 2 million, even 5 million, $1,364. That was more than the family could afford. But they scraped together what they could, and sent it. When they phoned again, there was no reply. Matavu's mother, Nkibiwuka, traded second-hand clothes in Owino, a downtown market. Now she was spending all her money trying to find her son, and her business had to close. She was too worried to walk on the busy streets anyway, with her mind so full of thoughts. "I can't go to work, not knowing where my own flesh and blood is," she told Aljazeera in early February. "I don't know whether my child is alive or if he is dead." 10 days after her son disappeared, Nkibiwuka got married. Matavu had been excited about driving her to the wedding. He had already ironed his suit. The wedding had been arranged for months and it was too late to cancel. In the photos from the day, Nkibiwuka looks back at the camera, head tilted, lips slightly parted as if to smile. But no smile comes. As polling day approached, repression intensified. Nicholas Opio, one of the country's top human rights lawyers, was kidnapped with 4 others from a city restaurant by plainclothes gunmen, and released 8 days later on money laundering charges, which the organization he leads dismissed as fabricated. Isaac Zebersanyange, a former national boxing champion, was shot dead by security forces in the street. More than 100 members of Bobiwine's entourage were arrested while campaigning. Some 36 of them, including his closest friends, remain in military detention. On January 14, under an internet blackout, Ugandans voted. 2 days later Muwonge was declared the winner, with 58% of the vote against 35% for Bobiwine. From his home on the outskirts of Kampala, Bobiwine said the vote had been stolen. "We have certainly won this election and we have won it by far," he told journalists. The battle now was for the declaration of results, DR, forms, the paper record of vote counts at individual polling stations, which could help prove if the election had been rigged or not. On the day after results were announced, Andrew Natumanya, Wine's official photographer, was driving from eastern Uganda with a car boot full of forms. He parked up to meet another activist. Then, he later told journalists, his car was surrounded by armed men in plain clothes. He and his colleague were beaten, forced into a vehicle, and driven to a police station. That night, said Natumanya, he was taken alone to another location, with a hood over his head. His captors wanted to know what he discussed with Bobiwine. They looked through his phone contacts, and found that he had saved Wine's number as the president. Then they put something on his arm which felt like an electric shock. "Call your president to save you," they said. Natumanya was released the next morning, but only after police had taken his computer, camera, and the all-important DR forms. And his story is not unique. The same day, another NUP activist came down from the north with several hundred DR forms. He tells Aljazeera that men in plainclothes and police uniforms raided the Kampala hotel where he and two colleagues were staying, then took them for interrogation at a building in the upmarket neighborhood of Kololo. They grabbed all we had, says the activist. The laptops, the gadgets, and even the DR forms. The activists were released from a police station that night, charged with falsifying returns and results. Others say they were taken to military facilities. Bobiwine's adopted brother-in-law Bwanika David Lul, better known by his DJ name of Selector Davy, was pulled from his bed by soldiers on the night of January 12. He tells Aljazeera he was beaten, held in a series of barracks, and interrogated about NUP's plans by military intelligence. He was released after 16 days, charged by an army court-martial with unauthorized wearing of uniform, a reference to the red people power beret commonly worn by Bobiwine's followers. Another activist says he was arrested by plainclothesmen in balaclavas who hooded him, squeezed his testicles, beat him, and kept him for 3 days in an underground cell at Makindai military barracks, where you cannot realize whether it is day or night. These testimonies suggest a coordinated, targeted attempt to disrupt the NUP and intimidate some of its key activists. But other abductions came in local clusters. A good example is the Muwonge North constituency, just outside Kampala, where at least 17 people were abducted. The incumbent member of parliament here was Ronald Kibuyule, the Minister for Water, famous for allegedly bringing a gun to parliament and for saying that rapists should not be arrested if their victims wear mini skirts. His NUP opponent was Abdullah Kiwanuka, a lawyer. It was said to be a fierce contest. On December 19, Kiwanuka held a rally in the village of Kitugo. As dusk drew in, some of Kibuyule's supporters appeared. There was a confrontation. Media reports said that one of Kibuyule's supporters was assaulted. Then, says Kiwanuka, 2 of his own followers were kidnapped by soldiers and taken to Kibuyule's house, where they were seriously tortured. One of the men claims that the soldiers harassed and beat him in the minister's presence. They beat us seriously, he tells Aljazeera. They wanted us to be part of them, to surrender the works of people power. He says he and his friend were then taken to a police station and released. Police spokesman Fred Inanga says the matter is under investigation and he cannot give details. In the following days, drones started pulling young men in the constituency off the streets. On the evening of December 21, men in plainclothes seized several people in Kabimbe village. They were just picking people randomly, one witness, who asked not to be named, tells Aljazeera. Anyone who was around was put inside and taken. Among those taken from a taxi stop were a conductor and a tout, neither of them known to be political activists. On the morning of the 23rd, at 2 a.m., the drones came to Kitugo. Witnesses and relatives say armed men, some in dappled blue uniforms like those of the police field force unit, smashed into houses with hammers and pulled 6 NUP supporters from their beds. One of them was found the next day in a forest 60 kilometers, 37 miles, away, beaten but alive. There were raids in other parts of the constituency too. NUP candidate Kiwanuka says his brother was taken from his house by soldiers. There was more trouble on the night of the vote. According to Ugandan media reports, soldiers belonging to Kibuyule's security detail invaded a tally center, held police officers and electoral officials at gunpoint, then stole ballot boxes. The Minister of Internal Affairs later confirmed that 4 soldiers associated with Honorable Kibuyule had been arrested. Both Fred Inanga, the police spokesman, and Deo Akaki, the deputy army spokesman, told Aljazeera that the case was under investigation. Speaking by phone to Aljazeera, Kibuyule rejected all the allegations against him, which he described as propaganda and the politics of lies. My soldiers have never been involved in anything to do with arresting people, because they're not meant to do so, Kibuyul said. How do I control people I don't command? I don't command the army. He also claimed to be unaware of the alleged interference with ballot boxes. I don't know of any soldiers attached to me who were arrested, he said. Meanwhile, the army obfuscated. On January 19, a court ordered that 4 of the missing people in Muwonge be released from unlawful detention. 2 days later, Joseph Musonyefu, the Joint Chief of Staff of the Ugandan Army, wrote to the Solicitor General and said that the 4 were not in army custody. But on February 13, Museveni said the same individuals were among 17 who had been arrested in Muwonge by a commando unit, an admission that the army was responsible all along. In the days leading up to Museveni's speech, some of the missing people in Muwonge had started reappearing, dropped off in fields, forests, and sugar plantations in the middle of the night. They had not been charged with any crime. One man with scars on his back tells Aljazeera that he was held for more than 7 weeks, in 2 different houses, where he slept on a hard floor with dozens of others. His hands were tied and a hood was over his head the whole time. The first commandment, it was about the mask, don't touch the mask, he says. We just knew that these people don't want us to see the place where they have kept us. Sometimes his captors beat him with batons and cables. They pulled out one of his toenails. You are rebels, they said. What are you planning to do after losing these elections? The disappearances in Muwonge North show how national tensions played out at the local level. But a final story shows how fear and accusations penetrated even deeper, into the micropolitics of daily life. The scene is a nondescript roadside in Bwaise, in northern Kampala. There is a small row of lock-up shops, a chapati stall, a cluster of motorbike taxis. In one of the shops, a teenage girl sells charcoal. Next door, a woman runs a bar. One day, after drinking a bit too much, the bar owner and the charcoal seller have a fight. Police arrest the charcoal seller. Some local men, who had seen the incident, go to the police station and explain what happened. The charcoal seller is later released. That is the account told to Aljazeera by the local council chairman, the landlord of the building, several witnesses, and relatives of 2 of the men. Many of them add that the bar owner was angry. In indignation, she boasted of having a brother in the army. On the evening of December 18, a few days after the charcoal seller was freed, a drone pulled up on the road. Men with guns got out, some of them in army uniform. Shots were fired in the air. The men grabbed several people, including the charcoal seller, the man who worked at the chapati stall, and 2 NUP candidates for the upcoming local council elections. The bar owner said that she could get the men set free, but it would cost $1 million shillings, $273. Locals mustered up the money. The next day she asked for another 100,000 shillings, $27, which they gave her too. Then she left the bar and stopped answering phone calls. Soon after, a relative of one of the abductees got a message from a stranger saying that 3 of the missing men were dead. People held a small protest on the street. It was only then that the families started getting calls from their missing loved ones, saying that they were in Makindye military barracks. Relatives say that 2 of the men were later brought before the court-martial, one with a walking stick and the other weak and beaten. Nearly 2 months after the abduction, the charcoal seller was released. Aljazeera was unable to speak to her. But the state still holds the men, Abubakar Kayamba, Silas Alina Itwi, Christopher Bunjo, Hakeem Mumbia, and a 5th, who the locals know only as Kanje. The prison's spokesman, Frank Bain, says they are now being held in Kidalia prison, charged with unlawful wearing of uniform, the familiar red beret offense. On February 10 the prison spokesman told Aljazeera that Matavu and Sunko, the young men who had been taken during an argument about posters, were in custody in Kozi prison, a couple of hours' drive southwest of Kampala. The next day the families rushed there in excitement. But just as they were arriving at the prison the spokesman sent another message. He had misinterpreted. Matavia was not there. What about Sunko? There was a man called Richard Sunko in custody, insisted the spokesman. But at the prison, the families were not allowed to see him. Instead, a prison officer brought them a copy of the photo on his file. It was not the Sunko they were looking for. After visiting the prison, Matavia's mother Nakibuwaka went to her ancestral village. An old woman there gave her the names of 3 young men, Baker Kawaya, Fred Kijimvu, and Emmanuel Bazira, who had also gone missing. There were photos of them too, dressed in long white Kansas, traditional robes, as though they were at a wedding. Let me know if you hear news of them, the woman said. On February 9, Aljazeera interviewed Flavia Bikwazo, the army spokeswoman. Were soldiers involved in the abductions? I'm just a spokesperson, I'm not an operational person, so I don't know the nature of operations that are going on. Why are people being arrested? I don't know. Are people detained in barracks? I'm not very sure. What about ungazetted detention centers? They were closed, I think so, but I need to confirm that. Has the military beaten or tortured people? I can't confirm or deny. The abductions have been headline news in Uganda for weeks. But state officials have consistently evaded questions about the situation, usually by insisting that more investigations are needed. It does not help that some parts of the security apparatus may not know what other parts are doing. So many things run parallel to each other as agencies, and sometimes they get mixed up, they run into each other, explains Gawaya Tegul, a journalist and lawyer who has worked on cases of ethnic Rwandans kidnapped in Uganda. He says it is often hard to distinguish between the roles of the chieftaincy of military intelligence and the Internal Security Organization, another intelligence agency. Both agencies have networks in the police. Meanwhile, the lines between military and civilian institutions are blurred. Some of the civilians arrested in recent months have been brought before army courts, even though Uganda's constitutional court ruled that this practice is unconstitutional as far back as 2006. Such trials are also prohibited under international law, a point reiterated in official reports by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. Despite those clear rulings and statements, the Army continues to rely on a 2005 law that says Army courts can try civilians found in unlawful possession of arms, ammunition, or equipment ordinarily being the monopoly of the defense forces. It is perhaps no coincidence that many of those abducted have been charged with unlawful wearing of military attire. In other instances, people have been arrested by the army, interrogated, and then transferred to the civilian justice system. That is the most common pattern, says Aaron Kiaiza, a lawyer who is working on a number of abduction cases. The military arrests someone. They detain him without authority illegally, beyond 48 hours. They take them to a police station and the police station creates a charge and takes him to court. Such practices are not new in Uganda. In 2009, Human Rights Watch documented unlawful detention, torture and enforced disappearances of detainees by the Joint Anti-Terrorism Task Force and military intelligence. In 2011, it detailed extrajudicial killings, torture, illegal detention, forced confessions and other abuses by the police-led Rapid Response Unit. But under Museveni, the victims have usually been people on the margins, Rwandans, Muslims, people suspected of violent crime. Others could look away, says David Mbanga, a lawyer and social commentator. As a society, we need to hold a mirror up to ourselves, he says. Our central nervous system has not been developed enough. The current wave of abductions is notable for its scale and for the level of public awareness, says Mbanga. That makes it different from anything seen before under Museveni, at least in the southern half of the country. And yet, it is also as though the country is circling back to the past. We've been here before, Mbanga says, referring to the dictatorships of Amin and Abid. Our parents were here. We know what they suffered. Kids would come back to school, sometimes with their hair cut short as they would in mourning. And we were told don't ask them about their dad, because their dad never came back. And it's very, very unfortunate that it's happening again. Nakibuaka watched Museveni's speech on TV. Her children wanted to change the channel, but she needed to hear every word the president said. She used to tell them about the good things Museveni had done, the peace he had brought. In past elections, she had encouraged her friends to vote for him. Now, as he spoke, she clung to a gossamer thread of hope. The president spoke slowly, with long pauses, the thrum of crickets in the background. He talked about that day, 35 years ago, that his army first marched into Kampala. He talked about assassinations and riots. Then he said that a commando squad had been deployed to defeat terrorists in Kampala. All those ones arrested, their names are here, he continued, listing examples. The final two names he listed were Richard Sunko and Dennis Matavuo. Nakibuaka fainted. It was February 13, 67 days after Matavuo and Sunko disappeared. For the first time, the state had acknowledged that it had taken them. Nakibuaka was happy to get news of her son but worried about what it meant. The army has still not said what Matavuo and Sunko are accused of, or where they are being held. Neither the police spokesperson nor his army counterpart has responded to Aljazeera's requests for information. Nakibuaka just wants to see her son again. The government should behave like parents, she pleads. If they were in the same situation as us, they would have done everything to get their children. In the meantime, she prays. And waits. For more visit JB Muwonge.